It's been about 2 years since I last did one, so I think I'm owed this. Let's just all collectively ignore the fact that this is the least original video concept out of the list of unoriginal video concepts. It's all in the spirit of fun, so I don't really care. It's time for a tier list. Now that we're well into the Savage tier, it's been a whole month even, and the dust is starting to settle in terms of balance and learning as the encounters have been solved, and even more than that, broken down into dust. I've done a bunch of static reclears and party finder on all kinds of jobs and I'm having a blast. My little disclaimer is that this tier list should be useful because it will be fairly accurate in terms of which jobs are better and worse, but this is firstly my opinion, and secondly, a little bit of fun. Balance in FF14 is pretty good for the most part, so those options that end up on the lower tiers are not bad by any means. You can still clear the tier and contribute a lot to your party in both damage or utility. So if your favourite job doesn't get the Special Boy #1 rank, it's fine. You're still allowed to play it. Instead of ranking jobs with S, A, B, C, you know, like the normal way that people rank things, I'm gonna do something slightly different instead. Right at the top, we have the Meta Slave rank, because if you want to be one of those, you're gonna pick one of these. These jobs are the creme de la creme. They do the most damage, and they do so without sacrificing very much in other areas. They are the best in their roles and fiercely strong. Then for the rest, we're going to steal the coloration and ranking systems of a certain illegal website that shall not be named. There are purple Peters for jobs that aren't quite at the peak but are still very good. Blue Boris is next, then come the green Gareths, and last, and also least, the grey Gabriels. I'll try my best to be aware of runtime and only speak on each job for a few minutes so that you're not sat here listening to me yap for an hour and a half. We'll see how long that lasts before the tangents begin though. I think we'll start off with one of the most overpowered jobs in the entire game right now that is an insta-lock for the Meta Slave ranking. But before we do, I actually have a quick sponsored segment. This video is sponsored by Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 just welcomed its brand new expansion, Janthir Wilds, on August 20th. Complete with quarterly major updates coming over the next year. With Final Fantasy XIV in a content lull for the next few months, it is the perfect time to try your hand at a new MMO, and one with the content portfolio that Guild Wars 2 has may just be the perfect fit. Featuring account-wide unlocks, which, let's be real, every MMO should have. A new weapon for all professions during land combat in the form of the two-handed spear. 3 new open-world maps, new raids, fractal dungeons, and the introduction of homesteads, which are account-wide instanced player housing, complete with these lovely gardens to decorate as well. It's also getting Convergences, which is a 50-player event, and the raid with the incoming challenge mode as well is the first new raid the game has received in 5 years. The mount system is one of the features of Guild Wars 2 that I always hear talked about, and it was one of the ones that made me most interested in trying the game myself, and this expansion is bringing an updated Warclaw acquisition method and a brand new mastery line. So, if you want to try out one of the best MMOs on the market, Guild Wars 2 is free to start right now. You can join one of the most welcoming, diverse communities in gaming right at the release of the brand new expansion Janthir Wilds now. Thank you so much again for sponsoring this video. Okay, so before I so cruelly cut to commercial, I promised you the first overpowered job that is clearly top tier, and it's Astrologian. It just does it all. I recently made an entire video about it that's coming out pretty soon, and to quote that one specifically, which I suppose counts as a preview, I said that Astro is the healer with the best movement and the most damage and some of the most broken healing tools and crazy raid buffs, and it's also the best pure healer in terms of mitigation and OGCD healing, and also, by the way, the best at healing the tanks, and they are weak at nothing at all. It's true as well, this job is crazy good in light heavyweight. Because the spike healing checks in the tier are very lenient, Astro being the pure healer with better party mitigation is an even stronger boon than in some previous tiers. This time, they have 2 of them, and their tank healing feels so overkill that you're often able to spot heal individual DPS going into pain point mechanics with either shields or mitigations, similar to how a Dark Knight would throw out ablations like candy in those situations as well. It has tons of movement in all the right places, Macrocosmos feels incredible in every encounter when used wisely, and its damage is absolutely brilliant, tracking a solid 500 plus ahead of every other healer's raid contribution. If you insta-lock any healer, this is the one you want. Astro is just a step ahead. White Mage is the other pure healer, so I suppose it makes sense to throw that into the mix next. I've got a special place in my heart for the Flowery healer. It was the first class I picked up when I started the game, and admittedly, that's because I read the description of the job that stated it was adept at both healing and offensive magic, and I excitedly exclaimed to myself that it must be really OP because it could do everything on its own. I had no idea how the MMO Trinity system worked at that point, so I certainly had a few home truths to learn pretty quickly, but despite its simplicity and having long lived in Astro's shadow, I really love the job, and I actually think it does pretty well in Dawntrail thus far. White Mage's effectiveness as a healer hinges on its ability to get a lot of value from plenary raptures to cover most of the incoming damage in a fight, and especially in both M1S and M2S, you often end up just sitting on lilies or burning them for alignment, mana, and misery, because there just isn't enough healing needed to keep up with the acquisition of stacks. It feels good, and critting 200,000 plus damage miseries with a crafted weapon gives you all the serotonin you need to get through the rest of the full lockout of wipes ahead of you in Party Finder. The issue with White Mage is that its direct competitor is the healing equivalent of peak LeBron James. White Mage is offering much less in the way of damage, the lowest of all 4 healers. Less damage reduction and shielding, less tank and spot healing, less free movement if we only consider the volume of GCDs with that free movement, but it does uniquely position itself for certain pain points, such as Ion Cannon in M4S and Fuse Field in M3S, making both of these problems cinch in a way that Astro has to commit more resources to replicate. I do think it's the weakest healer, and despite it having those really shining moments occasionally, they aren't enough to get it a high placement in the tier list. I debated between putting it in blue or in green. It's either a low blue or a high green. So what I'll end up doing is being cruel and authoritarian and stick it in green. It'd be too predictable if I started off and did all 4 healers in a row, so instead let's do a few melee DPS now. I want to talk about Viper first, not only because it's one of the 2 new additions and it's interesting to see whether it has contributed in shaking up the overall status quo of the now 6 strong melee DPS role, but also due to the fact that, like Astro, I've recently dedicated an entire video to yapping about the way this job plays, albeit with slightly more criticism than in the healer edition. I think it's fair to say that when designing the challenges present in this raid tier, the Square Enix Encounter design team had a picture of Viper up on the wall next to them the entire time, with a little sticker next to it that says, "The Specialist Boy," because it just feels like every moment that was set to be a point of difficulty for most of the other melee DPS is just another walk in the park for Viper. No small part in this is their capability to stockpile and utilize 3 GCDs of melee downtime freely without much loss, and this tier is rife with moments that either force 1 or 2 GCDs of downtime every now and then, or make you work really, really hard to keep uptime during them. Viper just doesn't really need to worry about that so much, and is unique in being able to fully and easily keep uptime during the start of Ion Cannon in M4S. Most jobs can prep maybe 1 GCD of range there, or 2 at a push, but Viper is just ahead. Viper is also the top melee DPS in terms of overall damage contribution. It's not by a large margin. Monk and Samurai especially encroach on it very closely at times, with Monk even having a higher possible ceiling. But unless you're like a top 3 player on a fantastic run, Viper's better. Viper is relatively easy to digest and understand as well, and it's usually immediately obvious once you've done an encounter once or twice where those optimization points are, positioning it as what I'd consider a best-in-class DPS for light heavyweight. It's going in meta slave for sure, because it's just the best at what it does right now. Moving on to Ninja next. Ninja is one of those jobs that, aside from 1 or 2 niche short instances, has always been an incredibly desirable pick. Ever since Heavensward and Stormblood, where it was one of, if not the strongest melee, thanks to their game-changing raid buffs and party utility, combined with insane damage. to the relative ease of momentary disconnects thanks to Rinon and Shikuchi, which is still the only floor-targeted melee DPS gap closer in the game. We ignore that little stint at the start of Shadowbringers because it's an embarrassing moment for Ninja in what can otherwise be considered a glowing track record. It feels like the all reliable of melee. You can always count on it to be strong, and if it isn't, it's going to get fixed real fast to become it. Unfortunately, right now, it's the weakest melee in terms of damage, though only by a tiny amount. Dragoon is just a little bit ahead of it at the 95th percentile, and it's not a huge difference at all. I do think as the tier goes on, and especially as the expansion grows, Ninja will end up pulling ahead even without any more balance adjustments because it is just such a spiky burst job. So it'll improve as full parties attain gear and more groups are able to place it in optimal scenarios. Runs with a really good crit rate, kill time and comp will probably see it go up multiple places in the melee chart, but those are of course not the standard. I think that when it comes to DPS jobs, the three major metrics that matter more than anything else in order are their damage contribution, how easy and efficient they are to play at peak performance in the fights themselves, and what unique defensive utilities they offer to the party. So Ninja's going to have to go in blue, unfortunately. Let's do a third melee now, filling in the gaps with the blade studier himself, Samurai. Samurai has received 2 sets of changes thus far in Dawntrail. Firstly, some very underwhelming alterations in 7.01, then, alongside Savage in 7.05, much more sweeping and comprehensive changes. Bigger changes, in fact, than the ones they received on the expansion release itself. Now Samurai can do their follow-up Tsubame Gaishi after every Madare, and more than that, you can stockpile a Tsubame as it is a flat timer now instead of a use it or lose it follow-up, leading to interesting optimization and downtime management moments. I'm actually a big fan of this iteration of Samurai. Thanks to the auto crits that a lot of its higher hits have, it has a very consistent damage profile. It's easy to play at a base level, and it has a bunch of small things you can do to fully optimize, which is really fun to do. Third Eye has always been a unique and engaging job mechanic too, to provide you with extra gauge, and it feels good to play well with. Samurai Sen skills also have a slightly longer range than their melee attacks, allowing you a GCD of disengage often, which can deal with most of the pain points in this tier. In terms of damage, it's right in the middle of the melee DPS role, shifting based on the quality level of the player wielding it. At high end, it's always behind Monk and Viper, and sometimes below Reaper as well, though the difference is so negligible between most melee that their balance is generally very good. In fact, to give you an idea, if we discount Viper, which is a few hundred ahead of the pack at most ranges, looking at the 95th percentile, so a good indicator of correct gameplay, there is only around 400 DPS from Monk at the top, all the way down to Ninja at the bottom. I think that's healthy and good, honestly, so Samurai gets a purple. We have jobs in almost every tier now, except one very noticeable omission. There's not a single Grey Gabriel yet, so let's fill that up to provide a little more parity, shall we? Machinist. The physical range DPS role is the weakest in the game at the moment, lacking any core identity that sets them apart, or any innate strength that makes players want to pick them. The proof is in the pudding because out of all the DPS roles, physical ranged has the least number of Savage clears, consistently has a low pick rate, and only really secures its spot in parties by being a provider of part of that oh so precious 5% buff. If the 1% provided by Fizz ranged hadn't been implemented, you'd see a lot more runs opting to leave them out entirely in favor of higher potency options. When the entire run is only holding on via the government-mandated party buff they provide, it's a given, but when one of those jobs also happens to be the worst DPS in the entire game in light heavyweight, it's going straight in grey. Machinist looks cool and I really enjoy playing it. In fact, it's my favourite to play within the role in terms of gameplay, but when it isn't given the opportunity to stockpile a scenario which is only usually provided often in ultimate encounters, it just kinda sucks. Bard, on the other hand, is the best Fizz range right now, offering a solid amount of personal damage and utterly insane raid DPS contribution. The better your group is, the more Bard scales in power as the rest of the party makes efficient use of its powerful damage buffs. So even though Thanks to its Fizz range debuff, it's on the low end of the overall party damage. You still very much get to feel like a credit to team. All Fizz ranged have access to at least 2 roll defensives, one of which is unique, and Bard gets Nature's Min, which is one of the better options, providing synergy with shield healers, especially spread low, and making the numerous multi-hits this tier much easier to deal with for the party. So Bard can get slapped right into blue, albeit a little low on the scale. I do feel somewhat guilty giving the best in class Fizz ranged a very mid-tier placement, but unfortunately, that's the nature of the role at the moment. I do think that gameplay-wise, Bard is still pretty fun, with 3 distinct songs offering distinct gameplay styles, and a level of micromanagement in carrying them through downtime phases effectively. It's interesting to do, but outside of quality of life changes and the fiercer than ever burst windows, it didn't change all that much from Endwalker. Dancer is the finale of this role, and it's getting a green. Usually Dancer feels like it's the strongest thanks to the fact that you are in essence in a symbiotic relationship with the top DPS, there to help them succeed and reap the rewards of precious raid DPS in exchange. Being a job that performs exceptionally well in the 2-minute windows and doesn't require quite as much gear to scale effectively is certainly a unique strength. But in Dawntrail, Dancer just isn't able to reach those same heights as what Bard brings, and whilst it isn't suffering the same grey fate as Machinist, its stock is definitely not as high as it has been previously. Having both Curing Waltz and Improvisation puts it a little ahead of its direct competitors in terms of sheer number of unique job nits, with 3 for Dancer over 2 for all the others, but I don't feel like they're enough to shore up the difference. I didn't talk for too long about Fizz ranged as a role because, to be blunt, it's barely changed in any meaningful way since at the very least Shadowbringers, maybe earlier. So aside from Bard surging ahead a bit more this time around, none of this is going to be too surprising to anybody. I hope they do something with it soon. To whip back around and finish off those 2 barrier healers I didn't do earlier, we'll take a look at Scholar next. Scholar is the job I progged M4S on, and the one I've played most overall in light heavyweight thus far. And to summarize it in one single sentence quickly for you, it's really good. Spread Adlo has been a uniquely powerful defensive tool in most Savage raid tiers, and this one is no exception, standing above practically everything else that any other healer can offer in terms of potential to dull the pain of hard-hitting parts of fights. Scholar is now the healer with the least available DPS neutral movement, but there isn't too much this raid tier that requires extremely prolonged running around, so as long as you plan your sly casts carefully and are happy to use swift cast for movement, trusting in your party to not die to something silly, you can absolutely make do very well in almost every mechanic. Scholar is also currently the 2nd highest DPS healer, sitting behind Astro but ahead of the others at high percentiles. Chain Stratagem is still incredibly strong, and Baneful Impaction was a lovely addition to that burst window strength, even if it is weaker than the burst potential of all 3 other healers in terms of what they can output in a short space of time. Scholar's kit has always been a mismatch of components that don't quite fit together perfectly, but reward masterful play with high performance, and in light heavyweight that hasn't changed whatsoever. I'm putting it in purple right at the top, because whilst I don't feel it's an immediate pick like Astro is, should strength be your primary objective, I do think it's better right now than Sage, the healer I'm going to discuss next, and it's a very valuable asset to your party. Sage is the other barrier healer, and it's fair to say it's essentially a direct competitor to Scholar, so let's directly compare them. My opinion on the disparity between these jobs are that Sage is easier to play, faster to optimize and learn to a highly efficient level, and possesses a number of tools that can expedite your progression through a raid, but it often falls behind Scholar when you have a level of comfort and knowledge about the timeline of a fight and in overall damage contribution with an optimal party. I still always bring Sage to progression of early Savage turns where you're expected to kill quickly and without any time to practice timings properly, because it brings consistent shielding whilst moving, a stronger ability to burst heal the raid via Numa, no damage cost on Kerachol and Ixachol, meaning you can spam them very regularly without a care in the world, and the new addition of Philosophia allowing you to bridge the gap between Sage and Scholar's brute force shielding capability somewhat. In terms of damage contribution in an optimal scenario, it usually falls in that 3rd place finish, ahead of White Mage, but below the others. I do think Sage is actually very good and brings a lot to the table in the scenarios I mentioned, and it also has so much more damage neutral mobility than Scholar that it isn't even funny. But when encounters are designed around being clearable consistently and efficiently on the harder job, when most of your unique boons are centered around being easier or faster to get X done, that doesn't equal out to much in the long term. I do think that Sage is better at dealing with Ion Cannon in M4S and also Fuse Field in M3S than a Scholar is, and those are the two biggest problem mechanics in the tier from a healing perspective, and that will definitely be gaining it a few points. So, Sage will get a purple like Scholar. But I do believe that Scholar is definitely better. That's why Sage is all the way down at the bottom, and will stay there, whereas Scholar is right at the top. Casters next? Yeah, why not? We can get a quick one off nice and easy with a little explanation. Pictomancer is going straight in Meta Slave. It is the strongest DPS in the game right now. Full stop, in every role. And it does that without being endlessly complex to perform on. It's fun, engaging, but fairly simple to understand. And whilst it doesn't bring a res, when you compare it with Black Mage, its direct competitor within the role, it has more party-wide mitigation, and a raid buff, although said raid buff is already factored into what makes it the strongest in damage contribution, so I think we can kind of push that one to the side. But more importantly than that, it's easier to play and perform on, which is kind of wild. Both of the new dawntrail job entries are top tier choices which any raid group would be happy to have, and I think the greatest note about Pictomancer is that we aren't even seeing it at full strength. Aside from one moment in the M4S Phase 2 transition, where you can get 2 paintings off for free, there isn't really any downtime in light heavyweight. Pictomancer loves downtime, because whenever the boss is untargetable you can prep paintings, and the more this happens outside of burst windows, the better. In Ultimate we can expect a lot more downtime, as has traditionally always been the case, so I expect it to power scale even higher. Just look at what it's doing in the Omega protocol right now. Black Mage is in a really weird spot at the moment. When dawntrail launched, to be blunt, it sucked in terms of balance and was barely worth bringing, only marginally able to push past casters that had a res, but with the commitment of way more effort investment. This came right off the back of an overwhelmingly poorly received job overhaul, which dedicated Black Mage mains did not like at all, and play rates sunk through the floor as users flocked to the new, shiny, overpowered Pictomancer instead. Now having received some very significant damage buffs, and 1 or 2 reverts bringing back beloved spells such as Ice Paradox, Black Mage is actually in a very unique and interesting spot. At lower percentiles, its damage is still pretty middling, if not outright bad. That much is true. But as you go up to those higher tier players, the ones that have mastered the new playstyle and maximized their potential and stayed steadfast with the job, using their new i730 gear to play this instead of Picto, it's been noticed that a well-played Black Mage can actually output really good damage. In fact, it's 4th in high percentile gameplay, behind Pictomancer and the top 2 melee DPS, but above all others. Black Mage is still pumping. That said, the effort you need to expend to do so is still very high, and seeing it far below its direct competitor is a bit rough, honestly. I don't think Black Mage is bad at the moment, but it's really one more job buff away from being a really strong pick. Right now, the best I can give it is a blue option, but offering nothing but damage and not even being the top in its role in terms of that, directly against a job that gives more for less. Now, we come to the one that I'm expecting will upset people, as it's very popular. Summoner. I don't think it's much of a secret that I don't like Summoner very much gameplay-wise, because I think it's boring and hasn't grown whatsoever since Endwalker. But previously, it was still a very worthwhile pick despite any gameplay gripes. This time around, it is not. This tier, there are only 2 reasons to play Summoner. Either you enjoy it immensely, and honestly that's fine, I respect it if you do, or because it's a crutch. Its damage is consistently the lowest in the role, being hundreds behind Red Mage, its direct competitor for a slot. It can't offer the same strength in terms of quick succession reses, or a second raid defensive utility, and really, the only strength it possesses is being incredibly easy to play and with mostly free movement, and I suppose in very niche cases survivability with Radiant Aegis. This is the weakest Summoner has been performance-wise for a long time. And so, I'm putting it in grey. Red Mage has gone through somewhat of the reverse experience as Summoner going from Endwalker to Dawntrail. It was incredibly weak, and didn't have many positions in which to allow its unique job strengths to shine, making it by and large the worst pick within the role. And despite being harder to master than Summoner, it did less damage. In Dawntrail, it does more damage. The value of raises has grown massively, and Red Mage is uniquely positioned to chaincast them. It's just the best at rezzing. It has Magic Barrier, and it gained extended movement options thanks to the addition of Grand Impact. There's also the added benefit of Red Mage being quite a lot of fun to play. It's very easy at a base level, but with a hidden layer of interesting optimization for those that are willing to seek it out. And jobs that possess that are more interesting to stick with over an extended period of time, it's fair to say. Red Mage is in a solid spot. You obviously won't be bringing it for damage over a non-res caster, but it is the best at what it does right now, and it isn't even close. So I'm putting it in blue alongside Black Mage. So what do we have left? We haven't touched tanks at all yet, and I have one that I'm pretty excited to talk about after it received adjustments. So I made a video talking about the tanks right before Savage released, and then we got a whole portfolio of tank balance changes, including one that I stated would push a certain job over the threshold of being average to becoming excellent should it be recipient to them. Paladin. Paladin was always fantastic, but sorely lacked in damage. I think that Paladin is the most useful progression tank when it comes specifically to utility and survivability, possessing an extra raid mitigation that no other tank has in the form of Passage of Arms. It also has access to Clemency on demand at a mana cost, which while this does lose you damage to use and you're not exactly going to break it out unless the group goes full on into a recovery situation, it is an incredibly powerful triage and sustain button in those situations, and one that no other tank can do without an associated cooldown. A significant chunk of their rotation, including half of their burst window, is made up of instant cast ranged GCDs, meaning that Paladin can safely peel away from the boss with only the loss of auto attack damage. And in light heavyweight, this capability pays dividends, because there are lots of moments where you need to disengage for a single GCD, and Paladin can just line it up with the Holy Spirit. It received a bunch of damage buffs as well, and through a combination of those and its ability to easily deal with disengages, has placed it firmly in the second highest DPS spot within the role at a lot of different percentiles, beating out Warrior by just a tiny bit in all but the most perfect runs. I actually think instead of discussing the other three tanks at length individually, I want to talk about the entire role real quick. Balance is very solid for the most part right now, especially in terms of damage. There is no wide dearth between the top and bottom picks at most percentiles in every fight, thanks in no small part to those Dark Knight and Paladin buffs, meaning that aside from Gunbreaker being categorically the strongest in damage, the others are swinging above or below one another depending on composition, kill time, and crit rate, which is a really healthy position to be in balance-wise. You can generally make your choices in terms of tank almost entirely off the backs of their defensive and uptime options at the moment because the gap is so small. This tier, especially M1S but not exclusively that turn, has a very heavy physical damage focus. I don't think this is a particularly bad thing. We've had encounter design flip to the other side of the coin many times, so this happening isn't a terrible outcome, but I do believe that all mitigation should work the way that Feint and Agile do to combat this. That is, if you mitigate the correct type of incoming damage, such as a magic mit versus magic damage, you get 100% effectiveness. And instead, if you mitigate against the wrong kind of damage, like magic mit versus physical damage, you will instead get 50% effectiveness. Funnily enough, I also think this would mostly fix the pain points with Dark Mind, which very much feels like a wasted cooldown this tier in many sections. Having it be a 10% damage reduction versus physical on a 60-second cooldown is actually really solid and puts it pretty much in line, if not sometimes better, than the other tank's unique 90 seconds. As things stand at the moment though, shield party defensives have higher overall value than magic mitigation ones in light heavyweight. I also think that Paladin and Gunbreaker have the best 2-minute passives on their cooldowns, increasing max HP and providing a Giga Shield, and that is also a factor. Warrior has incredible self-sustain, and Paladin does very well in the same field against a single foe thanks to their self-heal on burst and Holy Sheltron being crazy good. Gunbreaker has those targeted regens on top of the incredible Heart of Corundum. Honestly, I think all three of these tanks are reasonably equally matched, and they each have different strengths and weaknesses and boons over one another in different situations, and they can all go in purple right next to each other. Dark Knight is worse though. It can still spike very high in damage as it always has, but aside from those ideal runs, it's in the middle of the pack. That's not why it's weaker though. As I've said, all of the tanks are reasonably well balanced damage-wise. It comes from a mixture of Dark Mind either being incredible or worthless based on the fight and phase, which is not ideal by any means, and also from TBN being a little wonky in its opportunity cost. That said, Dark Knight is not bad as such in raids. Its main weaknesses come from exterior content like dungeons, and I think that TBN and Ablation are kinda solid this raid tier. Dark Knight gets a blue, although I thought about giving it a green. I believe that in order to complete this whole tier list, there is just 3 melee DPS remaining. I've mentioned one like 5+ times whilst covering other jobs, so it is an easy insert. Monk is actually a meta slave. In almost every way, Monk is just the second best melee DPS in the game right now, and it's also the one with the highest overall potential, even beyond Viper. Though the amount of work you need to put in to reach that potential is obviously also a lot higher. I considered putting it in purple due to the work you need to put in to surpass Viper, but it also brings Mantra to the table, a party-wide AoE heal when you proc Riddle of Earth, and has fairly solid disengage thanks to having 6-sided star and 3 stacks of Thunderclap, enabling you to pull out of melee range for multiple GCDs with a moment's notice. Monk is really fun too, so I decided to give it the highest ranking instead of the more boring purple option. Monk right now is very powerful in the right hands. Dragoon is my favourite melee DPS on the whole, but it is definitely not in the best place it's ever been. It's funny because I commented on this regarding Ninja, but the same is true of Dragoon. The two traditionally meta melee that are just super strong and versatile have been knocked down a peg in Dawntrail, and just aren't as powerful at most levels of play. The moment you have to disengage, you're throwing spears, leading the lance-wielding job to want to carefully and precisely manage their uptime to avoid unfortunate events. Whilst their damage isn't bad per se, for reference at the 95th percentile, it's just a hair below Samurai, making it the 5th melee in terms of damage at that point, but not by much. A good run could see it easily push past both Samurai and Reaper, and all 3 of those middle of the pack melee are pretty balanced in the damage department. It's just Dragoon doesn't really have anything else. No unique raid mitigation, no ease of disconnect, just their damage, and when directly compared with some of the stronger options it's up against, it can feel like it's been left behind a little. It goes in blue, truly a mid option at the moment. And at last we come to Reaper. Reaper was looking crazy when the expansion released, before many DPS received 1 to 3% damage buffs with Savage's launch, and it was positioned to be one of, if not the strongest melee in the game. I don't feel that's quite the case anymore. It's still very good, but Monk and Viper perform consistently better and bring more to the table. What Reaper does have though is an easy to manage rotation, high burst damage, Arcane Crest to give it something a little unique in the raid utility department, and very respectable damage. It's a purple for sure. I'm gonna link you the tier list in the description of the video, so if you want to make one yourself, you're very welcome to. Honestly, if you do, I'd be curious to see them, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts as well. Do remember, this is all in the spirit of fun. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.